The two main contexts you're using a deck in are when you send it to someone to get the meeting, and when you're having the meeting with them to try and convince them to invest. And those are actually very different contexts, but you're using the same thing both times. And so you've got to somehow craft the deck to fit both of these, right? So right now I'm sitting here talking to you, walking you through these slides. And so I can add narration over it, like, oh, we used to work on this type of thing, that type of thing. That's much more like in a pitch meeting where I'm there to help fill in the context for you. But in the email, you only have what you see in the deck here. There's no voiceover. The reality is you're just like skimming through this. The investor's like looking at like 4 of the slides, seeing if there's something that jumps out to them. And you've got to somehow communicate enough to them there that they actually get the understanding of it, right? It can't be your typical presentation deck that just has a picture and you're going to fill in the content. But it still can't be 20 bullet points and filled with tons of text, because the answer is they're not going to read it. So you get like one sentence, maybe a sub bullet point, a graph, an info thing. It's got to look interesting and sexy to capture their attention, but communicate enough content that they can do it without you talking them through it. So a typical deck is going to have between 10 and 15 slides in it. And if you are having a hard time getting the content down to that number of slides, that means you've got way too much content. And this is really important because the person you're sending the deck to has no idea who you are, has no interest in reading a 70-page deck about you. You've got to communicate with them in the 2 minutes that they're willing to spend on this. So you want to really go through this outlining process super carefully and say, if we only get them to take away 15 thoughts from this entire 30-minute conversation, what 15 thoughts do I want that to be? These bullet points you need to hit on. And so when you're designing a deck, you want to completely structure it around how do I get them to take away this one thing, and everything else is secondary. We typically, again, we do this with these really, really big, bold titles here at the top. And then sometimes we'll have facts or stats backing it up. Sometimes we'll have pretty pictures. You want it to look engaging. Ideally, if there's a way to visually demonstrate it, that's better. Other times you're just kind of trying to fill the space so it doesn't look too empty. But if they just read nonprofits fail to capture the value of recurring donors and they ignored these other stats, that would be fine with me. So when you are putting your deck together, you want to think primarily about what your narrative is going to be. This is a really big part of generally anything you're doing in fundraising, is trying to understand what is the story you're trying to tell and how you distill that into something that other people can understand. So the first place this is going to come up is honestly when we were talking about the blurb earlier. That's really a kind of a small summary version of what's happening in the entire deck. And when you're doing a conversation with someone, your 30-second elevator pitch is also just a piece of this same question of like, how do you tell a narrative that's compelling to someone who doesn't think about it? But the simplest version of this that you really want to start out with is just like, what is the one sentence summary of your startup that's going to be compelling to someone who knows absolutely nothing about it? So when we were doing YC Startup School, they actually, every time we would come on every week, they would make us just go around the entire group and say like, what is the one sentence summary of what you're doing? Just like, give me that. And then they would just like collectively shit on why that didn't make any sense, right? And it's just like, you can't understand half the time what someone's startup is from their 1 or 2 sentence explanation. And it's really, really hard to get out of your own head into someone else's. So really, really key part of this narrative development is getting other people to tell you, I have no idea what you just told me. And honestly, this is like the main thing that I give to people as advice when I'm talking to them about how to improve their pitch, is just like, I have no idea what you said. Try again. You want to be able to get a kind of a sound bite that people actually have some vague sense of where does this position me in the entire world of startups. Because I didn't know before we started talking, were you going to be selling me on a hardware startup? Were you going to be selling me on scooters? Were you going to be selling me on building the next crypto something? Like, I have no idea. So you've got to orient me roughly where this all falls in a quick few sentence thing. Okay, so this is the first high-level slide, just like you want to have a cover page, basically. And this is really going to be that sentence that we were talking about earlier that you're iterating through. Like, you want to find something that if they read this, they're intrigued to learn more. The core of this narrative is the problem-solution framing. And this is the real crux of that 30-second pitch or your blurb or what is going to convince someone to be excited. They need to believe there's actually legitimately a hair-on-fire problem for someone. And they need to believe that you've got a solution that's 10 times better than the existing solutions for the hair on fire problem. So for here on the problem, we want them to feel like, oh my God, that's such a big issue. And so we made this, with these stats where there's just all of these facts that make you feel like, oh man, that's a wild churn rate. Like when you compare it to normal churn rates in industries, 77% of first-time donors are churning is just insane. And especially for VCs who are coming from a background of like places where you're going to get 15% churn or 20% churn, that's really the reaction we're trying to get them to go. Is just like, that's crazy. The entire industry is that broken. And also, the 8x higher lifetime value, where again, VCs are talking about lifetime value in a way that like charities are not. We want them to think like, whoa, okay, there's a lot of money here that's being left on the table. This one's kind of starting to bridge into the solution, but really the main thing we're getting out of here is actually social proof. Like we've got the big Duke logo front and center. We got a picture of Dan Ariely. Like we're talking about like, hey, we know what we're doing. This is also weaving in the narrative, right? It's also to make you feel like, oh man, like they've gone through this, they've really thought about this, they understand what's going on, and it's partly just an excuse for us to have a spot in that presentation to tell that backstory. But you kind of, anytime you have a chance to weave in credibility and kind of signal like we're legit, you want to do that because they're just weaving through all sorts of people who don't have that. And then we're into the actual solution, right? And the main thing you want is for them to just be like, oh yeah, I totally see how that would solve the problem, right? So here, we've found when we were pitching that no matter what sentence we would give, no matter what one sentence explanation we would give, no one would understand what our product was. And so until we start saying, so we would say like, oh yeah, creative giving rules tied to things in your life. And then you say, for example, every time Trump tweets, people give 10 cents to the ACLU, and everyone laughs, right? And like, that emotional reaction, what you're looking for, is like something where they can like really feel like, oh, that's exciting. And for us, for what we were doing in our product, it came from examples of these rules. And so we were just like, all right, let's have 12 of them. The other thing you get here is just like, we have these really nice illustrations. And so it was just nice to get like color into it and to feel like, oh yeah, we have a brand, and make this kind of pull out and not just look like text after text after text. All right, so this one, I think in retrospect, again, I would lean towards cutting some of these slides in here that are a little bit more narrative focused and go maybe more just directly to what our current product does and leave the narrative side just to the conversation. So this was an attempt to really show like, here's what we went through, because we had this feeling of like, look, like we're here, we've been doing this for 2 years, we had all this money, like what have you been up to this whole time if you're just all we have is this idea. So partially is to kind of explain what's been going on. The other thing you've got here is just a bunch of social proof, right? This whole side is just like, we were covered in the New York Times, like we got 4.9 out of 5 stars, like all these app ratings where people losing their minds about it, right? This is just like trying to make you feel like, oh yeah, they crushed it at this other thing and now they're gonna do this new thing. And then this is the, like, you want to make them, this was really honestly in our story, was to make them feel like the reason for the pivot, this is about like the overwhelming demand, which is really just a way of like explaining the problem from a different angle, right? It's just like nonprofits kept asking us for this thing over and over and over again. And again, notice we're sneaking in some more social proof here. We're dropping Sierra Club here, not calling it out, just having a screenshot of an example here to make you be like, oh yeah, they've worked with some pretty cool orgs. And yeah, this is a little bit of traction in here, but this is really all just to make you feel like, man, if people like Sierra Club were asking for this, maybe they really know what they're talking about with this being a problem. Okay, after some point, you have to just get into what are we actually doing? All right, we're building infrastructure for the nonprofits. And similar to that very first slide, we went through a lot of different versions of like, what is the right way to frame this? Ideally, you want to have like some very, very concrete examples here, some screenshots, something that just really helps it like pop out and jump out to you. I don't think this actually does a very good job at this. I think you kind of read this slide and you're like, I'm intrigued, you want to learn more. It's got some pretty pictures, but I think you could do better at just being like, here's what it actually is after all that wait. But luckily we get into that here, right? And so we've got the kind of, here's what our product is right now, and here's where our product is going. And that kind of is back to that whole point we were talking about before, which is like, they don't really care what you happen to have built right now. Here you want to give them the feeling of, this could be $1 billion company. This slide here is to make you feel like, oh man, they've got 1 million ideas of where this could go. And like, there's a big grand vision of how this is an amazing thing. And which one you started with isn't really that important. Well, this one's pretty straightforward. You've probably heard like up and to the right before, like we just have a graph, it goes up and to the right. That's just like, you want them to feel like you're taking off, right? Like a big part of this is just like feeling like this is about to explode and they should get on board before it takes off and they miss their moment. And so we actually it's not just a coincidence this graph goes up and to the right. We timed our raise very intentionally in advance at what we thought was going to be the peak of that graph. And so we started thinking like, okay, what's our traction looking like? When do we want to raise in here? What's the moment at which we think this is going to be the most compelling story? And like, if you're just starting to take off and you know that you're going to continue growing exponentially, you want to wait actually a little bit, because there's always going to look better if you've got 3 months of growth, right? And then like, if you have some reason to think that it's going to peak maybe, then you want to start raising before that moment, so that you've got a moment here where you can say, look at this. This is what's happening up until today. Imagine how much better it's going to be going forward. This is just social proof after social proof after social proof, right? Where it's like, oh, did you notice that John Legend and Cory Booker and Mark Ruffalo are tweeting about us? Also trying to drop in some kind of traction evidence here, right? Like, oh, cool, like they raised 1.5 mil. Like this is something real here. And really like everything in the social proof category is just like, how do you differentiate yourself from every single person and their mother who had an idea in a garage and wrote it down on a napkin and then can like put together a PowerPoint and email them, and they're like, great, I don't know anything about donation infrastructure. Maybe your idea is amazing. Maybe your idea is terrible. How do we tell whether you're onto something? It's not going to be by directly evaluating the product. It's going to be by feeling like, oh, well, they went to Yale, or oh, well, like Mark Ruffalo's tweeting about them, like something that lets them feel like, oh, there's something here that's worth looking into more. This is more on the traction side to help you think about just like that feeling of momentum of just like, oh yeah, things are happening, things are in the works. This is actually a pretty important point. Like when you are raising, the investors are going to want to see that things are continuing to move while you are fundraising. The longer your fundraising goes on, the harder this becomes, because you're spending your energy on raising, and so a lot of the other things are going to grind to a halt. But if you can have anything to indicate interest, even if it's not like 7,000 people are using our thing, if it's just like, you can say like, we've got these LOIs, where we've got these letters of intent that indicate people want to use this, or we have like this many conversations happening, or this many people on a wait list, right? Like there's kind of a cascading like level of like how valuable this information is. And anything you can show movement on is going to be really important, both when you start that conversation, but they're also going to start looking at like, over these months, how does it do? And so they'll often like start conversations with you, and then like 3 months later they'll invest, because they can track whether over those 3 months you actually made progress. And this is really, really annoying, because you're spending your time fundraising not making progress on that stuff. This is a really, really hard trade-off to figure out how to balance. And I think like the thing we did here is we just had like one person on our team who was like just continuing to try and like sell, and then two people on our team who were just like, we're just going to be trying to fundraise. But ideally you've got some way to indicate both that you have some evidence that people are interested in this, and then also continue to make progress over time. Like I was saying before, you just want to make them feel here that like there's some way you can make money. They do not care at all whether there's any evidence at all behind that people are willing to pay like $50. It'd be great if you have that and you can say like, oh yeah, like, and this many people paid us $30 for the thing. But like, they just need a believable story about like, yeah, people probably would pay money for this. Like, here's why we think it. Not that you've got massive numbers of paying customers. If you do, great. But you don't want to be like in an area where people think there's no way you can make money from that and have no story about this, right? Like, especially in the nonprofit world, people are very worried that you're not able to make money from nonprofits. There's been a bunch of kind of failed nonprofit startups, and people are very worried that charitable giving is going to be like this. And so we had to think pretty carefully about like, how do we kind of differentiate ourselves from that? How do you make it feel like there's a real money-making strategy here? In this case, the thing people were worried about was that nonprofits are not willing to pay for software because they don't have that much money. So we said, all right, well, the nonprofits aren't the ones paying for it. The donors are. We've got evidence here that donors are leaving 10% tip on top of their donation. Now suddenly it's a completely different market size calculation. You're not looking at how much are nonprofits spending on software and then what portion of that you're going to capture. You're looking at how much are donors giving and what portion of that are you going to capture as revenue. And that's a much, much, much larger market, right? Like suddenly you're looking, oh, there's $450 billion donated in the US every year. And, then you start making up these crazy claims like, well, if we captured 10% of that, then, there'd be $45 billion going through our system. And of that, we're going to get, 10%. And so we're going to make, a 10% tip on that. We're going to make $4.5 billion per year. And it's like, no, you're not. That's not how that, but like, they don't need to believe that it's actually going to happen. They need to believe there's a plausible story for how you could make money. And this business model just says, yep, we've thought that through. Like you can go through these top down calculations, and the goal here is just to make them feel like, yeah, there really is a whole market here, and like not just that we're like solving a problem for these like 17 people, right? Because when you start out on a startup, the typical advice is find something that like 10 people are obsessed with, not something that 1,000 people vaguely like. And so, ideally here you're coming to them with like 10 people are obsessed with this thing, and they now want to know, okay, but like, are those 10 people at all representative of a thing that has 1 million users? And like, if those 10 people are like, oh, well, it's only people who are wearing like green shirts on Tuesdays who live in Minnesota and are over the age of 37, the answer is like, well, there's just not going to be 10 million people who do that. But if you've got a kind of a broad estimation of how many people are in the same category that we've gotten a possession from, then they're going to feel excited that this could really go somewhere. People often worry on this that if you've got competitors, you're really in trouble. Like, oh, well, how are we going to make them think we're going to actually beat this other person? It's important to think about what is really a threatening competitor and what isn't. Like, the reality is there's 1 million other companies in the nonprofit fundraising space, and like only 2 of them are over $1 billion. So one important thing is just to be like, realistically, like a Series A startup is not Google, and like you could be 5 years behind them, but it still doesn't matter. You could overtake them. The other important thing to notice is that like there's a reason that massive companies like Google get overtaken by startups. Is like they're slow to move. They can't actually do things very quickly, and startups have the ability to kind of pivot and iterate and go through all these different things. And so you don't need to be that worried about there being other things in the space. In fact, you often want to be worried if there's no one in the space, a completely silent space. That suggests there isn't a lot of people complaining about this, and no one's that worked up about the lack of solution here. And so you kind of want to have the competitive thing do both show, yeah, other people are trying to work on this, and like, yeah, there's really demand for a solution here, but they're kind of doing a bad job. Here's how we're going to do a better job. And so if you can communicate both of those feelings in a competitor analysis slide, that's great. Don't feel that worried about the fact there are other people out there in space. That's actually a good sign. And then on the team slides, you're basically just trying to make them feel like you're legit. You just want to have as much social proof here as you can. Talk about your expertise, make them feel like you guys know what you're doing. We're trying to drop in other investors, other folks who've been involved, right? The key thing here is just for them to feel like these people are a team that's going to figure it out, even if they don't have the answer yet, right? Like YC typically will invest in the person, even if they take the idea and they think the idea is terrible. Sometimes they'll just be like, hey, like this idea, we don't think it's going to go anywhere, but we're going to accept you into the batch anyways because we believe in you. And that's pretty common, even if it's not that extreme. That kind of vague sentiment is pretty common in investing, where they're really betting on you as a person to figure out the 13 ways that you're wrong, because there's 1 million things that are wrong about you, this deck and this product and this solution right now, and that's fine as long as they think you're going to be the kind of person who figures it out. And honestly, this is a really important point for you when you're pitching, is like, you don't need all the answers. You don't need to try to pretend you have all the answers. Like, the conversation with them is not convincing them that every single thing they're asking about you know the answer to, because you definitely don't. Even if you think you do, you're still wrong. The thing you're trying to convince them of is that like, you are the kind of person who's going to figure that out. And if they believe that, and if they think you believe that, then they're far more likely to invest than if you happen to have the perfect 13 answers to their questions, but can't possibly figure it out. Like, if I've talked to someone else who can figure out answers and they've handed me all the answers, and I've got like my little book of all the answers, but I have no ability to figure out new ones in 4 minutes when we have to pivot or there's a new problem we didn't predict, you're not going to believe that I'm the kind of person who can figure that out. And so the question is not, do you have the book of answers? The question is, can you write the book when the question comes up? And that's our deck. So this is the kind of equivalent of the problem slide. You can see how we really had an issue here, which is we had 3 different problems listed, and well, eventually we pivoted because it turned out none of these were bad enough, right? So I think it's actually pretty telling here. You really only want to have a single thing, and that should be so compelling that this on its own is enough. And I think we probably should have taken this actually as a warning sign that we were trying to like backfit a solution and discover the problem from it. If I was remaking this slide now, I would definitely throw out number 3, and I would just reframe number 1 and 2 as both donors and charities want a better way for donors to find the charities they care about, and no one is helping them do that. Evidence that like we didn't really know what our problem is the fact that I had 5 different things on this next slide, right? 79% of donors want to give more than they do. 85% want a better way to reduce suffering. 81% want to see the impact of their donations. These are completely different problems and completely different value props. And if I were thinking about this now, I would say red flags should be going off. Like the VCs should have been more worried about the fact that this seems like completely different problems. And sure, I'm claiming that our solution solves all these problems at once. But in general in life, anytime someone has 7 reasons for something, that usually means they don't have one strong enough reason. And I think this should have been more concerning to both us and to VCs. Again, under product slide here, right? Again, we're giving the examples to make it really, really concrete because we found that was the moment where people always react. And then you get a little bit into the product here and how it works. This is really to signal like we know what we're doing. We like just are citing like a bunch of different papers, and we're trying to give our narrative here of like we have a background in behavioral science. Like here's all the things we really leaned on that in what we were doing because we were running an accelerator that used behavioral science to teach people about product and growth before this. And so saying like here's all of the ways in which that is going to translate into what we're doing is pretty important because we didn't come from a tech background. We didn't come from the startup world. We had to figure out how do we make our story feel like something that VCs will think, oh yeah, of course they're going to knock this out of the park. They came from that background. In this one, we did a why now. You'll see this in some decks, not in others. I lean now more against the why now slide, especially because this was like a pretty weak story. But I think, well, the issue with this slide is really that we had 5 different why nows. And I think like if you had one that was really compelling, that could be good. But I think if you need that many, it's not a good sign. This is probably the most interesting thing here is just we didn't have any traction, right? We had like 5 people using our like Android alpha, I think, when we raised this. And so the question of how do you convey traction or evidence that there's like the point of traction is to show your problem is real and people actually want it. And also ideally if you've got traction, it conveys that. But the question is like, are there other ways we can communicate that? So we ran a study, right? Like we were coming from a research background. We said, all right, let's run a study with 1,400 people and let's find out like whether people actually want this. And we compared it to one of the best things in the finance world that was kind of a best parallel was a Roundup savings app. We were doing Roundup and donations. And so showing side by side that we basically could go head to head and actually beat them on how likely people were to download this, even though we didn't have that many real downloads, showed, all right, there's some real demand for this thing. Understand a little bit about the target market. That's not something we did before as much. And I think a lot of times you don't need this, but this was something we went into a bit here. That's kind of translates through pretty nicely into these slides about like what's our market size and how much of that are we going to capture, right? And these again are these like kind of made up TAM calculations of like, yeah, there's $280 billion in the total available market because that's how much was happening back then. And like here you can see like how much of that's online and how much of that's going to be our share of the market. And this is really just to give them that feeling of this could go somewhere big. No one really believes these numbers, including the investors, but they always ask you for them, so you've got to include it somewhere. You get your revenue model in here. And then this is that go-to-market slide that I was talking about before, where we were basically showing like here are all the different ways we're going to go through and actually convince people to use our app or get downloads or find and reach people. And so it's useful to have a few different ones. This might be more than you need. If you've got one really killer one, that's great. But just saying like, oh yeah, like the point here is you're signaling, look, we know how to think about marketing and we've like got a sense of how we're going to actually reach people. And so just kind of giving them that feeling. What is the core of what you're doing? And probably the core of what you're doing is going to be very different than what you think it is, because the nuanced reasons about why you're different than someone else in the space, that is the reason that you think this thing should exist, is too nuanced to get someone else excited about it. Like the same pitch probably will work for you and the competitor that you think you're vastly better than when you're talking to another person who's never thought about the space at all. And that's going to be painful for you, right? It's going to be really painful for you to dilute your message so much that it sounds exactly like the thing you're trying to beat and is terrible for all these reasons. But that's really, really important that you don't get so in the weeds and so hung up on all of these minutiae that the person can't understand what are we even talking about in the first place. And the biggest mistake I see when people are putting together slides is they're trying to say like 7 things at once. And that partially comes with that because, I told them before that they only got 15 slides and then they try to communicate 35 things in every slide. The answer is no. You only get 15 thoughts. It's not that you only get 15 slides, right? With 5 to 10 hours, a really good designer can take your stuff and turn it into something really incredible. So what you need to send the designer is going to depend on what designer you're working with and where you go in the process. Especially because I can go all the way up to making mediocre designs, then I can often go further in the process than other people might be able to. But really what you ideally want to have is probably a Google Slides or something, or a PowerPoint of each slide you want to have and the rough content that you want in there. They're not going to decide what you want to say and what the words are. Ideally, you may even want to have some pictures in there. If you're we definitely want to have this screenshot in here, right? But a good designer, a really good deck designer, is going to help you in conversation figure out what there should be. And so you might say actually we want a visualization here of we want an icon here, and they'll find an icon for you, right? Or you'll be I want to have something that makes you feel, just kind of generally evokes the charitable giving concept, and they'll find pictures of that. And so any content you can give them, if you've got screenshots or illustrations or all sorts of stuff, you can dump that to them, and that'll help them. But the main thing they need to know from you is what's the content on the slide. And so often we'll do a very rough terrible outline of each slide, and we'll be a sentence goes here, and attempt to be this thought and then this thought and then this thought, and then they'll kind of come back through and they'll reorganize it and they'll make it look pretty and they'll put pictures in and they'll clean it up. But it's really, really an iterative process. The first deck you get back is not going to be amazing, and you're going to be oh my god, this needs this and this and this, and then you give them feedback, and if they're a good designer, they'll learn over time what you want the brand to be and how you want to shift things, and so you'll go through a few iterations, and then once you've got that locked in, it's much easier to churn out new slides after that. That can be between a few $100s and $1,000 depending on how many iterations you take.